Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start in the next 2 to 3 minutes. For the time being, I do want to let the members who are actually attending online to know that there's a survey that is being administered. It's a diagnostic survey just before the session starts. And then there will be another evaluation to see what you actually learned from this session. And just so that people can actually appreciate what we're trying to capture, we want to get something that looks like, which is, we want to actually see what kind of skills people pick up by attending these sessions. And we also want to look at the maturity levels of those skills. So we can see the shift from when you came to the session, as well as what you actually developed by the time that the session actually ended, so that we can produce graphs that look like this. So this is a matter of data collection, which I think is very important, given that this is a research data management session. So I would definitely encourage people very strongly to take part in this evaluation. We will be circulating the link within the chat section. And for those who are here physically, you will be assisted so that you can take part in the evaluation. We are going to get started right now. First and foremost, I'd like to thank all of you for joining this session, Introduction to Research Data Management, whether you're attending physically as well as virtually. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you chose to be here. And for that, I'm very grateful. And I hope that you'll actually be able to learn a lot by virtue of your attendance today. My name is Simon Swango, and I'll be conducting this presentation for the rest of this afternoon. Just as a precursor, I'm not sure how many of you have seen the Matrix, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with resource data management. But let's presume that you're in that position of Neo from the Matrix. Just by way of show of hands, have any of you watched the Matrix? Yeah. Okay, we at least have 3 people. So you know what happens in the movie when Morpheus presents Neo with a red and a blue pill, in which case he is trying to basically enlighten Neo. And in this case, you are being presented with that pill that will actually enlighten you. We assume that you will take the red pill so that you can actually be enlightened in this case. So the idea is that you at least take away some knowledge before the end of this session. So just in terms of the outline, what I'll be covering today is basically what research data are, what research data management actually amounts to, the fundamental aspects of research data management, and we'll look at the research data management lifecycle. And finally, we'll look at research data management support that is actually provided at this university. Just briefly, by a show of hands, is there anyone here who's actually familiar with research data management officially? Or is this why you're here because you're not? All right, then let's just take it from that perspective. So this will be boiled down to a very fundamental level. It takes assumption that you're not necessarily familiar with it. I presume that the bulk of you are postgraduate students, so you will be dealing with research data. So it then makes sense that you should be familiar with the proper data management practices out there as you conduct your research. So the starting point is, and I like to work with definitions here, is what are research data? And in order for you to define research data, you should actually have a good understanding of what data are in the general sense. And data is basically the lowest level of abstraction when you look at the DIKW pyramid, which starts off with data. And from data, you work your way up to information. When information is actually analyzed, you wind up with knowledge. And ultimately, that births wisdom. So you go down to what data actually are. And in this example that you see, data is the color red. And that is actually interpreted by someone who's gone to a traffic light and they see the color red, and it informs them that they actually need to actually stop at the traffic light. And when they apply that in context, they need to make sure that they stop the car when the light actually turns red. That's just the gist of how you build your way up from data to wisdom from an abstract perspective. Now, data can take on different forms, as you can actually see on the screen. It can take the form of numbers, text, audio, images, and video. But in essence, data are basically symbols, so to speak. So when you actually want to move from data to research data, because data do exist outside the context of research, you can define data as, well, basically that data, that research data are any data that are collected or generated for the purpose of analysis in order to generate or validate scientific claims. And they can take on various forms, as you can see from the various file formats that you see there. So you can have audio files, video files, documents, you can have code, images, text, molecular data, geographical data, etc. And what this shows is also that, to a certain extent, research data are also discipline specific. The type of research data that you work with is directly related to the kind of research that you're conducting, and that is also discipline specific. Some people conduct laboratory research, where some people go out into the field. They may actually, either they'll interview people, they may have focus group discussions, or they may actually take samples from natural elements, such as rainfall, such as temperature, etc. So these are discipline specific to a large degree. Now, having at least obtained a general understanding of what research data are, then you can actually gain a better understanding of how you can manage the research data. And that brings us to the question of what is research data management? Now, there are those, when asked, they generally say, well, research data management must be the management of research data. Now, that is partially true, but it's actually a circular definition in the sense that it defines the concept research data management by itself. And that's actually a bad definition. So what we'll try to do is sort of like unpack this definition to get a working definition. So generally what you'll find is that in the field of research data management, most practitioners or institutions like to work with research data life cycles, because this shows you the life of the data, if you can put it that way, from the moment that the data are generated or from the moment that they're collected to the moment that a research project comes to an end. And there are many types of, or at least many iterations of this research data life cycle, many more than what you see on the screen here. But these are general purpose life cycles. They are domain agnostic in nature. But what you will find is that perhaps in your specific field, there are differences that are not necessarily apparent when you look at these general purpose life cycles. But this is a good working tool for you to at least understand that research data go through some kind of life cycle, even though the specific nuances may actually differ at the discipline level. So the way that you collect your data in the field of astronomy might differ from how you actually collect your data if you're in the field of physics or microbiology or psychology or even law. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll conceptualize research data management in terms of the life cycles. So first and foremost, what you should understand is that the research data management life cycle is actually a byproduct of the general research life cycle. So you can view these as two sides of a coin. Generally speaking, when people conduct research, they'll work through the research life cycle. You come up with you define your research problem, you conduct your literature review, formulate a hypothesis, design your research, collect your data, analyze your data, and you produce a research output in the form of, if you're a postgraduate student, by way of example, that would be a dissertation or a thesis. If you're a fully fledged researcher, the output would be a research paper or research article, or it could be a book chapter. But this, to a certain degree, can ignore the data that actually underpin the research. So if you were to look at the back end, the other side of the coin, what you would be doing is you focus on the research data life cycle. And if you were to look very closely at these life cycles, ignoring the actual colors, but just look at the actual names of the stages, you'll find that there are some similarities. For instance, data collection is present in both of these life cycles. Data analysis is present in both of these life cycles, by way of example. But what you'll find is that when the research project comes to an end, that's where the two sort of like divert, where so with the research lifecycle, the focus is on the research paper or research output, whereas the data actually take on a different life cycle, or at least a different form. Either they'll be neglected, they can wind up in someone's hard drive and just be stored. But in terms of actual data management practices, they can actually be managed. They can be shared and disseminated and curated. But that is largely ignored if you just focus on the research lifecycle. Now, you could do a combined life cycle and do a more holistic one, but I prefer to split these two so that you can actually see the difference in terms of what is actually going on behind the scenes. So how does that lifecycle actually emerge? In terms of what I showed you a 5-stage research data lifecycle, which actually started off with data collection. Then you analyze the data, process and analyze, share the data, curate the data, and then the data can be reused. It is important to note that the data are curated and reused during sort of like the same stage. If the project has come to an end, then the data are actually curated and then they're made accessible. But what I did not include was the fact that there's also another step, that is the data management planning stage. And that has to be inserted into this 5-stage life cycle. So we build what becomes a 6-step life cycle. It starts with the data management planning phase, which is at the very beginning of the process. Now, I will go into a deeper dive of the life cycle. So in this case, I'm actually just pointing out the different phases. There's 6 stages that actually exist in this case. So the planning part, and then this allows us to actually come up with a working definition, which emerges directly out of this life cycle. And in terms of this, we can actually define research data management as a process. And naturally, it has to be a process because research itself is a process. So the life cycle must be based on a process. So RDM, research data management, is a process which entails 2 things. Firstly, planning for the manner in which research data will be managed during and after a research project. And I'll stress the fact that there's management after the project has come to an end, so that you don't neglect the data when the projects come to an end. And secondly, controlling for the collection, processing, analysis, sharing, dissemination, curation, and reuse of the research data. So in terms of this definition, you can clearly see that the first part literally takes the first step of that life cycle, and everything else is really steps 2 to 6. So if you understand the life cycle, essentially then you'll be managing your research data accordingly. Now, before we delve into that life cycle, it helps to actually just get a bit of a understanding of some of the fundamental aspects of research data management. And there aren't too many that we'll go through, but it is worth knowing what these things are. So firstly, it helps to know what the goals of research data management actually are. Otherwise, people might ask the question, what's the point? It's all fair and good to know what research data are and what the definition of research data management is. But what is the goal of managing research data? So there are 3 goals that researchers should actually be aware of. Firstly, research data management exists so that a researcher can assure that data are capable of supporting the analysis of the research that they're actually conducting. 2, to assure that all operations performed on the data are traceable. So there's a provenance record. If someone is supervising your research project, they can actually look at the steps that you actually made, or you can do the same thing as well, so that if you've actually made a mistake in a process during your research project, you can actually rectify certain things. You don't want to actually produce flawed research data that actually don't support your research findings. So if you can actually track the operations, you can actually make changes or spot where the flaws are. And the implications of these things will actually become apparent later on. I can't go into the details today, but what I should point out is that you may view this as a mini series of RDM sessions. So for the next 3 to 4 weeks, that's what I'll be covering. And I'll go into a bit more detail when I go into the session on data publication or data sharing, where you'll see the ramifications of failure to actually trace operations performed on research data. And then thirdly, the third goal is to facilitate use of the data by people other than those involved in the original collection, management, and analysis. So this doesn't apply to the researcher or, let's say, their supervisor, or if it's a research project that involves several stakeholders, that would also include collaborators as well as a PI, principal investigator. So if you ignore those individuals and look at someone who's going to reuse the data, or someone who's going to just analyze the data. It could be a peer reviewer or someone who's really just trying to reuse the data after the data have actually been published, after the project has come to an end. Those individuals need to be able to reuse the data. So that's one other reason why the data must be managed accordingly. It's not just for the sake of the people involved in the research project itself. Then The next thing that I want to draw to your attention is what's known as the FAIR data principles. These are core principles that underpin the management of research data. They basically stand for FAIR is an acronym that stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And I won't actually unpack these in great detail during this session, but I will at least go over some of the core aspects that I should bring to your attention. When we speak of findability, essentially what you want is for someone to be able to find the data. So ideally, this works by actually having the data on a medium that can be accessed via the internet. So if the data are on your flash stick, external hard drive, a memory stick, by way of example, they're not necessarily findable by the public, so to speak. So you'd actually put those online, let's say using a data repository, and then you'd have a persistent link such as a DOI, that is a digital object identifier, that allows people to find the data. Then there's an aspect of accessibility. It is linked to the findability aspect. And in terms of accessibility, you'd obviously make sure that you try to ensure that the data are open accessible, so that the only barrier to the data is access to the internet, as opposed to a paywall where someone actually has to pay in order to access the data. And it also means that the data need to be described using metadata that makes them findable, so that someone can conduct a query online and actually find the data. That is also tied into the interoperability aspect, which is the I. That is, the metadata that are used should be standardized at the discipline level. And it should be metadata that is dependent on what's known as a schema, a standardized schema, that is something that can be exchanged between different systems. Now, it's fairly easy. If you use a schema that is standardized, then it would most likely be exchangeable between different systems. But perhaps even more importantly, the terms that are used as part of that schema should be standardized, at least at the discipline level. So if you're in the field of microbiology, you should be using terms that other people in microbiology can understand, even if they're not residing here in South Africa. As long as they're microbiologists somewhere in the world, they should be able to understand that, even though someone in the field of geography or history, anthropology, or biokinetics might not be too familiar with those terms, but at the discipline level, they should be comprehensible. Then finally, there's the reusability aspect. And this basically means that it should be possible for someone to reuse the data in the future. And by that, what I mean is that there should be some kind of license that allows someone to actually use the data, simply if they acknowledge you as the original data creator, for example. But perhaps even more importantly, this speaks to the comprehensibility of the research data. The data should actually not be flawed, have so many errors or mistakes, or be so difficult to understand that people in the field itself cannot actually make sense of the data. If people cannot make sense of the data, they cannot use the data. It means that it doesn't make a difference if the data are findable, accessible, interoperable. If they cannot be reused at all, then it would mean that everything that a person has done has actually been in vain. Now, there is something to be stated about what the FAIR principles try to advocate in terms of making research data open accessible. And the reality that there's some data that just can't be made open accessible. There's some data that are sensitive in nature due to intellectual property restrictions, as well as due to data privacy restrictions. For instance, if you're collecting data from human participants, you cannot just go and share such unrelated research data publicly. So there has to be a balance that is struck. And the mantra that is generally used is that research data have to be as open as possible, but as closed as, what's the term? It says open as possible. I can't believe it's slipped my mind. But essentially, they have to be open, but they cannot be, but not all data can actually be open. What I'll do is I'll describe this quadrant here that actually brings this to life. What you want is a situation where the data are open and fair. So they comply with the FAIR principles and they're made open and accessible. But we understand that's not usually possible. So you can find yourself here, which is a compromise zone on the bottom right-hand side, closed and fair for those who are attending virtually. What you don't want is to wind up on the left-hand side where the data are closed. I mean, where the data are open, but they're not FAIR compliant, or even worse, on the bottom left-hand side of the quadrant, where the data are closed and not even FAIR at all. So the data should be fair and open if possible, but closed if that's actually the more practical option. And then finally, the last principle is the care data principles. Now, these apply more to research data that are collected from indigenous communities. So it's a bit of a select group, so to speak, of research data. But in terms of these principles, the data need to make sure that they speak to the collective benefits of the community. There's authority to control, that is, there's permission that is granted by the community. The data are treated responsibly and collected in a responsible manner, and that they comply with ethical conduct and ethical prescriptions. The key thing is that the data must have some kind of benefit that will flow back to the indigenous community. It shouldn't be a case where people are being exploited for their research data. The intersection between these two principles, that you want research data that are compliant with FAIR principles as well as the care principles, where the research in question involve indigenous communities. But you don't really want a case where the data do not comply with either the care principles or the FAIR principles. This brings us back to the stages of the life cycle before we go into a deeper dive. Now, what I want to pinpoint is that what I showed you was a simplified version of the life cycle. In reality, there are various sub-elements that you find under each and every single step. And it's not practically possible to go through each of these. I'll try to do my best to scan through these. And by scanning, what I mean is that where the various subcomponents repeat themselves, I won't actually repeat them during the life cycle still. But what you do is, like, if you can represent this in tabular form, which is what I like, and you wind up finding something like this. And when you view it this way, what you'll see is that there are certain aspects of the life cycle, certain things or processes that have to be repeated. So one would always look at data documentation. When you collect your data, when you analyze and process the data, when you share the data, you look at organizing the data during more than one stage of the life cycle. You will always, generally speaking, have some component of data storage. So that's what I mean when I state that there's some components that will actually repeat themselves. So let's do a deeper dive into the research data management lifecycle. By the way, are there any questions before I carry on? No questions so far online? Going once, going twice, going 3 times? All right. All right, so we'll start off with the data management planning stage, the very first one. And here I won't go into too much detail because tomorrow and the day after, I will actually host 2 sessions on the detailed aspects of data management planning. What I can state here is that this is the planning phase where one will actually plan everything that happens during the rest of the life cycle. So you actually articulate how you plan on sharing your data in the future, who will be responsible for managing the data, who actually collect the data, how the data will be collected, how the data will be processed and analyzed, what are the ethical and legal implications that one actually has to watch out for, and how does one mitigate or manage those risks? What kind of data documentation will a person actually utilize? How will the data be stored and backed up? Those things actually have to go into what is called a data management plan. And that is something that is generated during the very first stage of the life cycle. Now, during the rest of this presentation, we will go into the detailed aspects of those things that one would actually try to address when one actually drafts that data management plan. That expression came to my mind. It's as open as possible, as closed as necessary. Yeah, I know it. Yes, research data have to be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. All right, so let's go to the second stage. That is the second step, the data collection stage. Now, most of the things that kickstart here will actually be repeated simply because you're still managing them. So just because you are storing data as you collect the data doesn't mean that you won't be storing them as you process and analyze them. But we'll start off with the legal and ethical compliance aspect. This is not in any particular order of importance, by the way. And then we'll look at documentation, file formatting, data organization, and then storage. So if you look at the ethical considerations, these are things that will apply specifically if you're collecting your data from human participants. Are any of you collecting or plan on collecting data from human participants here? So this will be very relevant to you. You will need to get ethical clearance from consent. You'll need to look at anonymization of data. Yes, Fabi? Oh, okay. Perfect. Okay, I'll slow down. You have to look at the anonymization of the data, if the data are anonymized, or if they aren't, then one has to think about the de-identification of the data. Now, these are pure ethical principles, but what you'll find is that they have actually now been crystallized in the form of legislation. So when you look at data privacy laws, such as the POPIA here in South Africa, the Protection of Personal Information Act, or if you look at the GDPR in Europe, these are instances where you find that ethical principles have now been crystallized into statutory form. So there are bound to be a lot of similarities there. So things like the identification of data, you'll find that in the legislation. But for practical purposes at a higher education institution, you will actually apply for ethical clearance, and you'll basically be adhering to ethical principles, whilst also adhering to the laws of the land. And then there are also issues such as intellectual property considerations. What I didn't include here are things such as contract, research contract stipulations. For instance, if you're working with funded research and there's a research contract that has been signed, you might not actually own the research data. You might be conducting research on behalf of an organization. For instance, it could be SASO, it could be Anglo-American, Standard Bank, by way of example. So that organization might end up owning the research data, but you can still publish something, but the data might actually be prohibited. You might be prohibited from publishing the research data. So those are some of the legal considerations that have to be taken into account as you go and you actually collect the data. Because that gives you, it's sort of like ring fences or puts you in a straitjacket in terms of what you are permitted to do with the data. In terms of the IP, let me just go back to the previous slide. This is really a case where you're looking at copyrights, depending on the type of research you're conducting. It could be copyrights, it could be patents, trade secrets, or industrial designs. There are people in the field of biokinetics that might actually be working on something like this. I know a few years ago at this university, someone actually designed a chair, and they actually wanted to commercialize that. It was quite a unique chair. I never saw it myself. But that is an industrial design. It's probably not something that would have actually then been published as research data, but it's something that was commercialized. So since it was something that was going to be commercialized, you probably wouldn't want the designs to be publicized. So already you can start seeing the restrictions. If there's a patent that's going to be associated with the data, you're not going to publish the data immediately after finishing the project, because it will actually it might actually prevent you from being awarded the patent, because there has to be a novelty factor associated with a patent. And if something's out there in the public, then you can't argue that it's actually novel. So those are things that we should consider. But for the most part, patents and industrial designs don't necessarily apply to every single research project. But there's always going to be a component of copyright associated with research. The question is, who actually owns the copyright? Is it you, the researcher, or is it probably a funder, which might actually end up being the case? Then there's an issue of data documentation. By show of hands, are any of you familiar? Have you been exposed to the concept of data documentation in the past? All right, perfect. So I can just go into a bit of an explanation here. So data documentation are basically supplementary context files that actually describe the research data. So it is not enough for a person to actually just take data and make them accessible, let's say online. If you have conducted interviews, or rather, you made use of a questionnaire, and then there was something that's called a data dictionary that is exported. The data dictionary will have a list of the questions that you asked, as well as the options that you give people to answer. So for instance, you ask questions and you have multiple choice answers. Your data dictionary would have the questions as well as the options that people could actually select. So that when someone looks at the data in the future, they're not just going to see a finding, they will actually see the questions that people answered, as well as the options that they had. So they'll get a good understanding of what it is that you're trying to get at as part of the project. It doesn't help if we only see the responses that were picked. That is what data documentation does. And it gives people a provenance as well, so they can see the track record of what actually happened in the project. Now, there are different types of data documentation that actually exist. These are several examples. And to a certain extent, some of these are actually discipline specific. So the second one that you see is the electronic laboratory notebook. This is for people who will actually be conducting research in laboratories. And they've been using notebooks for decades, perhaps even over a century. But now we've gone to the electronic version. So if you're not conducting research in a lab, an electronic notebook might not be the best option, a documentation that you would use. You might actually want to use a data dictionary if you're actually making use of questionnaires, or you could use code books. But a general standard one, and this is something that I want to show you by example, is what's known as a README text file. If this link is still alive, then what you should see is an example of a README file. From my understanding, this came from the computer science field, but basically a README file will give you the context, such as the title of the data set, the people who are involved in gathering the information. So in this case, the principal investigator, the co-investigators, their names, their details, the biographical information, the nature of the data that were collected, the geographical collection where the data, the location where the data were collected, some information about the funding sources. So it goes deep, and then how the data can be shared and accessed, what kind of licenses can be used in this case. Can you use the data for commercial purposes in the future if you're reusing the data, or do you simply need to acknowledge the original creator of the data? If the data has some kind of spreadsheet or embodied in a spreadsheet, then what you'll find is that there'll be a description of the columns and the rows. So this is a detailed explication of the contents of the research data. And the idea behind this is that this is supposed to be a machine readable file. So the idea behind all of this is that it should facilitate research by machines, so that you can have software that parses hundreds and even thousands, or possibly hundreds of thousands of research data in order to come to findings. So, and I don't want to digress too much. When the pandemic hit in 2000, there were about 300 articles that were published, I think in the year 2020 alone, or between 2020 and 2021, relating to COVID-19. And the idea was, well, can we actually parse this? Because you couldn't expect one person to read 300,000 journal articles, but perhaps software could go through the data, because in this case, you had to see if the data were valid. And I'm not going to go into the detailed aspects of the projections that were made around August or September 2020 about how we were all going to die and how the virus is going to spread widely. But the thing is, you actually want to look at the data, because that actually tells you whether or not it leads you to the truthfulness of the account that is being proposed by a researcher. So you would want something like this to be parsed. So software could go through hundreds of thousands of records. Interesting enough, it turned out that about 85% of the research data were actually not FAIR compliant, meaning that software couldn't go through them. So out of the roughly 300,000 articles with associated research data, you can only go through 15,000. What a damn shame. Considering that we're going through a serious crisis globally, and this speaks to why the data should be fair. Software should be able to read the metadata. In this case, it was impossible because people couldn't comply with the fair data principle. That's where you can see the ramifications of non-compliance or compliance with the fair data principles. Now, this is a free and available README file, and any one of you can actually make use of it. That's why I actually showed you here. I showed you that example. The protocols are perhaps more relevant for the natural sciences, and due to time constraints, I won't be able to go through that as well, but you can go through it in your own time. But the most generally used form of data documentation is the README file. That one is really pretty much good enough just about for any field. But where instances do dictate it, like if you're working in the lab, you will need to have a laboratory notebook. Now, what I want to point out is that the importance of the type of data documentation is something that can influence your data publication in the future. I've had an example in the past where someone was working on a research project that was affiliated with a certain patent application. So the patent had not been awarded yet. And there was a researcher who actually had a laboratory notebook that disclosed a little bit too much information that would have been detrimental to that patent application. And that was submitted for publication. And so I reviewed this and we had to send it back because what was more ideal than I understood that in that field, you actually have to make use of a laboratory notebook because it was in the natural sciences. But for publication purposes, you would be better off by using a README file in that case because you would be able to disclose less information that would not compromise the patent application. So we actually ended up going with a README file, but the laboratory notebook was kept for the purposes of the provenance of the research project itself. So once the patent was awarded, then it would be possible for others to do it. But at that point in time, it would have been very detrimental. For those that were wondering what a data dictionary looks like, you would see something that looks like this, where you'd actually have the fields, the description. So this is an example of owner's registration for people who actually own vehicles. And then there's more information in the bottom table about the registered vehicles. So see the field name relating to this vehicle, the description, the vehicle identification number, the characters. So see that these are alphanumeric characters, etc. But you'll see the year in which the vehicle is made, the body type, the make, the color, the weight of the vehicle, the power, the cylinders, the speedometer reading. That kind of information, if you're actually conducting research, that's what you'd actually want to see what kind of information was actually captured. That is what you'd find in the data documentation. You probably won't find a journal article explaining that kind of information like that. But if you want to do a deep dive into a research paper and the research data, that is information that you would actually need. Now, the next point that I would like to then cover relates to file formatting. And this is something that there's some kind of characteristics of ideal file formats. And the key thing is, I really want to make use of what are known as open standard file formats. So that is reliant on open software to a large degree, simply because if you want everyone to be able to access the research data in the future, then the idea is that people should not require some kind of license or to actually pay a fee in order to access the document in question. So the reading file that I showed you is a TXT file. Anyone can actually use it. They don't need the kind of subscription to some vendors' software. But there are some widely used software that exists. For instance, Microsoft Word is proprietary, but it is very widely used. Ideally, you might not necessarily want to use that. Or if you're working with spreadsheets, you might actually want to use a CSV file because that is an open file format. However, we understand that Microsoft Excel is widely used, but not everyone has access to Microsoft Excel. They actually might not be reported, and if they find your research data in a Microsoft Excel file, they probably won't be able to read it at all. They'll just move on to the next research data. I won't say that they'll cost you a citation, but that would be a barrier. So the idea is to use open file formats and then move on to widely some file formats, even if they're proprietary. Now, even then, what you'd want to use is the XML version of a Microsoft Word document or the XML version of a Microsoft Excel file format before you get to the strictly proprietary software. I state this knowing that in certain fields, for instance, in GIS, what you find is that there are not too many open file formats that you find. There's a lot of proprietary software that people will actually have to use in order to access the research data. So this is not something that is feasible in each and every single field or occasion. But the general rule of thumb is you start with the open file formats where you save your files. And you can get guidance on the different types of file formats that exist. We would have this on our library guides where people can actually see what are these file formats that Sam is speaking about. So you get different types, whether it's relating to geospatial data or tabular data, whether it's video files, whether it's audio files, whatever given type of research data, you'll find that there are examples of what are recommended file formats, as well as acceptable file formats. So just from what I was stating, for the tabular files, you have your CSV files being the recommended ones, but you also have other acceptable versions, such as Microsoft Excel. You have the .xls as well as the .xlsx1. These are all the XML versions of the software. The link is included in the slides for anyone who would actually want to view this later on. And just one thing that I did want to point out about the file formats. The idea behind this is that you want to avoid the effects of long-term technological obsolescence. Is there anyone here who's familiar with the tool known as Lotus 123? Oh, no. All right. Lotus 123 was one of the earliest spreadsheet programs that actually existed in the early to mid 80s. And it was quite popular until Microsoft Excel came into the picture and dethroned it eventually. And down the line, Lotus eventually went bankrupt. I think it went bankrupt or went down, and it was taken over by IBM. And ultimately, after a while, for more than a decade, perhaps IBM stopped supporting it. Meaning that if you had your research data generated in the 1980s and 2 decades later, for some reason you wanted to use that data, you probably would struggle because that software is no longer supported. And you can't just transfer that proprietary software to Microsoft Excel and open the file. However, had it been saved in an open file format, that is something that would have been possible. Now, there are things such as emulators, which allow people to emulate that Lotus 123 environment, but there's certain intellectual property restrictions associated with that. And so the legalities are not necessarily something that would favor you. The idea is rather to use an open file format. I mentioned this because one would wonder what would happen in the future if Microsoft went bankrupt. I know it seems beyond thought right now, but if Microsoft went bankrupt, it would mean that, well, down the line, you basically wouldn't be able to use that software. In the 1980s example is extreme, but a more realistic one is someone who had the research data producing Lotus 123 in the year 2006, just a few years before it stopped being supported. That person would have actually been stranded. So next up then, there's the data organization aspect. This I won't go into too much details about. It really speaks to how you store your files on your computer, how you organize them to folders, as well as individual documents within those folders, and how this is actually structured. You structure things based on your projects, based on the researcher, based on the date, based on the instruments, based on the data type. It has to follow some kind of logical structure. This gives a better example. For instance, if you're collecting data, is it based on a project? And you can have the locations, the observations that were made, as well as the analysis that were made. And if the data were collected in more than one location, then you'd have a subdirectory called location 2 that would have a repetition of what you find there. That is observations and analysis. So ideally, this helps you to actually retrieve the data. And if it's really good for you, it means that if someone was to find the data in the future, they would also benefit from this structure. Instead of someone taking all the contents of those subfolders and literally just dropping them or uploading them into a single folder, and leaving it for someone to actually determine what goes where, just actually sift out the locations, the observations, and the analysis, not knowing whether they're associated with location 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if there are 20 locations, that becomes a problem. So the idea is to actually structure the data in terms of some kind of logical structure. But we don't prescribe what kind of structure, but those are the options. Then there's the file naming as well. How do you name your files? According to experiment type, experiment number, sample type, sample number. There are some examples, though, of what a good file name would actually look like, with the characteristics. The name should be descriptive. The name should be consistent. They should be short, preferably with less than 25 characters. They should have underscores or dashes instead of spaces, because the idea is that they will be read by machines and not just humans. And they should avoid certain characters, like special characters that you see there. To a certain degree, you may have seen that when you try to create files in Microsoft Word, you are prevented from using these kind of special characters in some cases. And then they can follow date conventions, as what you see over there. So the next slide shows you an example of this. So you can use this file naming system. I'll start with the one here. at the top left-hand side, that is based on the year, month, date, and site. So the interpretation, you can see, is the date and site name. An example of that would be data collected on the 15th of February 2014 in the town of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Or if you use a different example, the second one, that would be the date plus experiment number. In which case you would see the example has actual date. That is data that were collected on the 21st of October, 1999. And then there's a dash. And Western blot 07 is literally the experiment type and the experiment number. And then for instance, that can be drawn as that there was more than one Western blot experiment that was actually run. There were at least 6 others before that. So logically, you can make that deduction just by looking at the file name. And those are the other examples of different types of file names that you can actually make use of. Then we move on to data storage. What type of data storage medium will be used? We need to look at how secure the data will be and how the data will be backed up. I'm just looking at the time right now, and I think that we may actually have to go over time before to actually complete this. I think this should have probably been scheduled as a 1.5 hours session. That's why I was actually rushing. Are you fine with extending the time? Some of you will have to leave. Anyone else? Oh, okay. All right, but the recording will be available after this as well in this case. So with the medium of storage, this part is really important because there are a lot of horror stories that you get relating to data storage. And we'll start off by looking at the different mediums of storage. You don't want to find yourself falling victim to the long-term effects of technological obsolescence. I referred to that previously in reference to software, but it also applies to hardware when you look at things like this. I'm not sure how many of you recognize some of these mediums of storage. There's one that's probably not here, which was known as originally the floppy disk. Although you see it there as floppy, but the original floppy disk was a floppy one. I think it was 3.5 inches. It was quite large. It came out in the 80s. I think when I was a kid, that was one of the things that you'd see. And then it moved on to that was called a stiffy disk because it wasn't something that you could easily bend. And then what you found is that we moved on to flash sticks, and they stored data on memory sticks. We also had DVDs as well as CDs at that same time as well. But what you'll find is that anyone who had their data on the original floppy disk, all of a sudden, once the computer stopped coming out with floppy disk drives, was sort of like stranded. And if you look at the computers right now, where you're seated, you notice that they do not have any disk drives for floppy disks or even DVDs, which was something that was possible 15 to 20 years ago. They only have slots for flash sticks. And I sit here knowing that I have stuff in CDs right now, floppy disks that I can't actually access from when I was at undergrad, for instance. So you don't want to be caught in that position. So either what you should do is you transfer or migrate the data as the technology changes, or you store the data on a medium that is sort of like immune from those effects. So for instance, an internal hard drive or the cloud, by way of example. So there are pros and cons to storage, medium storage. The other thing is also that some of these are susceptible to loss, as in they can be lost, they can be stolen, they can be corrupted. Sometimes they just need to be reformatted. You might be working on your thesis, and I know stories of people working on their dissertations, and they only store the dissertation on one flash stick. And one day they plug it into a computer and it says, reformat your thesis. And then it's like, no, I lost 50% of my work. It happened to someone I know. I think it happened to me once, but luckily I had learned from that front. I had 4 other flash sticks that were ready. And I would also store things on my emails. But it's one of those things you should actually back up your data. And this is something that I'll pinpoint when I look at the data backup aspect. But the other thing is if you have sensitive data on one of these portable mediums of storage, and someone gets that, that means that they have access to sensitive data. You don't want to end up having to get sued as a result of that. But more importantly, you don't want to lose the data that you're working on that contribute to your research project. There are people who have had to not necessarily restart, but it sets them back. If you lose 20% of your data or just a chapter, worth of content. So there are some ratings here in terms of what constitutes good medium of storage. Some of these I'll take with a grain of salt, but the key thing is you'll see that you should have some kind of cloud-based storage and perhaps some kind of a network-based storage as well. The portable one, you should actually try to limit unless you used it when you collected the data. So maybe use a dictaphone to record conversations or interviews. That has to be portable. But the idea is to transfer it to something that is stationary as soon as possible. So you upload that onto a computer once you get back to campus. Not necessarily the phone. If it's on the phone, you transfer it and then delete the data because you want things that want to store the data in a secure system that will not be hacked very easily. And that brings us to the question of the issue of security. And security is being defined in this case as protection against loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next 2 weeks. There are 2 sessions on the management of sensitive data, so I can't go into the details here, unfortunately. But what you ideally would want, and this can be incorporated into your research data management plan, so have some kind of data security plan that indicates the basic security that you'd have in place. For instance, passwords, how often the passwords would actually be changed, things of that sort, who would be able to access the data, who would have permission to actually make changes to the data, or just to read the files or to delete the files. That has to be ironed out at the beginning. Would the data be encrypted? What software will be used? Is it something that's permissible by university IT? How will the data be destroyed if the data need to be destroyed at the end of the project? And then ideally, you want the people involved in the project to be trained on these kinds of matters. Are you trained their role first in terms of these techniques of managing the research data problem from a data security standpoint? And the destruction part really applies to data that must be destroyed due to the sensitive nature when a project comes in. Sometimes it's not instantly, it could be 5 years down the line, or perhaps 10 years down the line. But this has to be mentioned from the outset. And the data would be destroyed, not deleted, destroyed. So I don't know if any of you heard of, there was some incident that happened with the former Secretary of State in the US, Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, some scandal about emails being destroyed. See, they weren't deleted, no, they were erased. So it was something like that, where there's specific software that actually erases the content so that someone won't be able to go into a hard drive of the device and actually retrieve that. If you delete files, they can be retrieved, but they must be deleted or destroyed in this case. Not deleted, so they must be destroyed or erased completely using specialized software, usually recommended by institution IT, to make sure that they cannot be retrieved. And then insofar as the backing up of the data, and this speaks to the medium of storage, the idea is to follow what's known as the 3-2-1 backup rule. That is, the data should be stored at least on 3 different, you should have 3 copies, and they should be in 2 locations, one in the cloud and perhaps one, and then the other one's in a physical location. And one of these should at least be offsite. So for instance, you can have this at home and external hard drive, but the external hard drive must be locked away, put in a cabinet that's locked away, so that someone doesn't break into your place and actually steal this. But on campus, you'd actually have some kind of network storage, and then you'd also have the cloud storage. That will create some kind of redundancy, so that if you actually lose the flash, or if a computer crashes, you've got the data backed up in the cloud. So that's what you want. You want to create that kind of redundancy. And the kind of storage that you have also allows you to back up your data in certain ways. So in this case, we'll look at different types of backup schedules. Do you back up your data? And perhaps I can even ask this by a show of hands. How many of you back up your data daily? Weekly? Bi-weekly? Monthly?
Yeah.
Okay. It'll be interesting to see what happens in week number 3.
Even likely it's on my floor. Check that it's safe.
Yeah.
So you drive.
So you see, depending on if you're using those portable storage devices, you can't actually have a backup schedule that is automated. So you use technology that has a backup schedule. So if you're using, let's say, Microsoft OneDrive, and you set it to back up the data daily, it could be possible. or you can set it to this week. If you're working, let's say, Microsoft Word, and you work on a computer and you have Microsoft OneDrive installed on that device, you can actually automate that. So you want to have regular backups. Now, it depends on whether these are full backups or incremental ones. You can back up everything that you have, and then from there on, you simply back up the changes, the updates, so to speak. And that also speaks to the kind of backup device that you're actually using, the data, the medium of storage that you actually use. So that was just for data collection. Now, these things repeat themselves, so I won't actually go into those details again. What I would want to highlight is that are the things that will be different. So for instance, if you collected your data and the data still contained, like data from human participants contain their personal identifiers, when you process the data, you would de-identify the data. You would essentially remove the personal identifiers, whether these are direct or indirect identifiers. As for what those constitute, I can only cover those in more detail 2 weeks down the line, because there are quite a bit of them. And then when it comes to data checking, the idea is you as a researcher know your research data, you understand the field. So you can actually check the data for errors, for mistakes. That is not something that can be outsourced to, let's say, library staff or even your academic supervisor. They will depend on you to actually look at them. So that involves the editing of the data, the cleaning, the verification, cross-checking, basically looking at the validity of the research data. And then there's a data analysis aspects, and there are different ways through which the data can be analyzed. This can be influenced by the type of field that you're in. You could be applying some kind of statistical analysis, but you would, at the very least, either sort the data, you could code the data. There could be some kind of calculation. There could be data visualization involved. But this is something that researchers on the ground level would be expected to actually know as part of the research process. So it is part of the broader research data management process, but it's not something that, for instance, at a library will be supporting directly. The university can provide software that can assist you with this, but some of these are really things that you pick up within your specific field in terms of the kind of analysis that you will be conducting. But that is part of the broader management of the research data. But once you analyze the data, the idea is you should still have that information in your data documentation to indicate this is how I actually analyze the data, some kind of description. So that is the relationship between RDM and data analysis. You should describe the method that was used to analyze the data. Or as you start the project, you should describe how you plan to analyze the research data. And so that when the project ends, someone can look at your data management plan and they can see that is how this person planned to analyze the data, and then they pivoted and they used another method, maybe suggested by the research supervisor. Now, as you work on different files, there are a variety of versions of files that you would actually have. And it's important that the different file versions are actually included in the file names, usually. So you would either have numbers included, and then the final version of the document would have the word final as an appendix added to the name. So by way of example, if you looked at Plasma Paper 01 as an example, you see that there's a second version, version 2, and you get up to 15 versions. And after the 15th one, then once the person is done working on this paper, or at least working on the file, they'll add the word final to it to indicate that that is the very last version of Plasma Paper. And that is something that you just see, irrespective of what kind of research you're actually conducting, is something you'll find in the file names. But in addition to normal versioning, there's also version control. So there should be a distinction drawn between versioning, file names, and version control, which applies specifically to scientific code. And for these purposes, it's actually more complex than normal file naming, file versioning. You would actually make use of what are known as Git repositories. And I will show you some examples here. But essentially, it allows one to track changes that have been made to the software code over time. And you can also revert to earlier versions. So if you want to see the fifth version of the code, you can actually do that if someone is using a Git repository, which relies on Git software. And there's some very popular versions of these Git repositories. The most popular are GitHub and GitLab. These are, they make use of open source software. I know that I believe Microsoft bought GitHub, but for the most part, it's still open source software that can actually be uploaded onto the platform. And people can also upload their data to GitLab, and they can basically have different versions of that software code. And then they can also publish the code after the projects have come to an end. Is anyone here working with software code, by the way? Well, it might be relevant someday in the future. You never know, but it's at least worth knowing about these things that actually exist. And data storage from the perspective of data analysis, really, there isn't too much of a difference from what I stated previously, apart from the destruction of the data, because now that the data have been analyzed, they're in a position to be destroyed, although that date might be postponed by several years. Someone might want to query the original data, and you don't want to be in a situation where your project ended and you just destroyed the data immediately, and then a year down the line, there's a problem. Or maybe a paper is actually going through peer review and they want to see the data, and all of a sudden say, but I destroyed the data. That actually is a process that should wait several years. Then there's the issue of when you go to the project that's closed, now you're looking at sharing the data and making the data open accessible. There are legal and ethical issues here that need to be considered. Have the data been de-identified? Those things that you're supposed to have done during what was called the active phase of the research project. If the data had sensitive personal identifiers, that should be stripped from the data so that the data can be published. The proprietor would no longer apply to research data that are not sensitive and do not contain personal identifiers. Then there are also the copyright issues. Do you have the rights to actually publish the data? Do the rights to the data belong to, let's say, Rose University, in which case you can. But if you are conducting research on behalf of a third party that actually prohibits you from publishing the data, then the data should not see the light of day. The data would most likely go back to the organization in question. Those are things that need to be considered, and these will be unpacked in more detail in a session on data publication. But once again, the issue of data documentation that I previously mentioned, the data documentation will be built up throughout the course of the research project. And when you're done there, you'll compile the entire data documentation file. That can be published along with the research data as a supplementary document. And then the data would be shared or published. So you would share it privately on a one-on-one basis or with a few individuals, or the data can be published using some kind of repository or as a supplementary file accompanying the research paper. I can't go into the detailed aspects, unfortunately, during this session, but if you're interested in gaining more insight into that, you can look at the postgraduate training program and you'll see that there's a session specific on secure data sharing, and there's another one on data publication. So you can see which avenues you can use to publish your research data. It feels almost like a YouTube video where people actually refer you to different videos, but the reality is that there's so much content here that I just try to summarize these things in one session, and then I'll unpack these in further training sessions. But what I wanted to point out is that these are the different ways through which data can be published. The data can be published along with journal articles. So the standard mode of publication is a journal article, which is seen on the left-hand side here for those who are attending virtually. But the data can also be published as a standalone data paper, or it can be deposited into a data repository, whether it's a third-party repository, or here at Rose University, we have our very own research data repository. And then the data would be curated. So once the data are deposited into a repository, this assumes that the data will be published by way of some kind of data repository. Then the data will be curated. Essentially, they will be managed. So they will be received. They will be assessed, that is appraised and selected. Then metadata will be added to the data, and then they'll be made accessible, essentially published, and then they will be preserved for the long term. That is, they will be stored in a secure environment. That is something that is generally handled, at least at this university, that is handled by the library. But if the data are published as supplementary data, then it will be an academic publisher that will be responsible for that. Now, once the data have actually been published, then the data are actually publicly accessible. They're within public view, and there are two ways of looking at this. Behind the scenes, what you'll find is that the data will be managed. Someone will be looking at the stats associated with the usage. So how are the data being used? Have we received any cease and desist letter to unpublish the data because the research article associated with the data has had to be retracted? either because there were personal identifiers that were published or there's research fraud involved. Sometimes you get those kind of things, or there's copyright infringement. If that happens and the journal article has to be unpublished, then the data will also have to be unpublished. So there are things that take place behind the scenes. But from your perspective as a researcher, you'll see a publication that has gone out and other people will literally be going and reusing it. So similar to how when you conduct your research, if you're not collecting data from scratch, but are reusing data, you'll probably go to a data repository and you'll make use of that data. But from the flip side, whoever published it will view it from the lens of them being a data publisher and they're having their data being reused. Whereas you, the data collector, will be collecting the data from scratch as secondary data. So there's a consumption aspect as well as a production aspect associated with the resource data. And now the very last part, where I'll just cover in brushstrokes the aspects of resource data management support that are provided by Lewis University. Now, I want you to view this through the lens of what I refer to as a resource data management system, which covers the different stages of the resource data management lifecycle. So either you have your governance framework, your policies, then you have your technological systems or solutions, and then you have various services that support the use of those solutions. Now, this can be more detailed, but I've actually simplified it here. So at this university, we don't have a resource data management policy in place yet. There's a draft resource data management policy that is currently doing the rounds at the university. And if it does get approved, then we will actually have something that actually supports resource data management at the institutional level. We do have things like a data repository, but it doesn't have its own governance documentation. That will flow out of the resource data management policy. But it's standard for institutions to have a resource data management policy that gives researchers guidance on how they should manage their research data. So those things that you just learned about right now, they would be distilled into an RTM policy. So that as an institution, we adhere to those best practices as well. And then in terms of the technological solutions, we do have a research data repository. And that's what the interface actually looks like there. So you are able to actually take your data, upload the data to the repository, have the data published, provided that the data are not sensitive in nature. We also have an information resource known as the Resource Data Management Library Guide, which you can access, and that's what the homepage of that library guide actually looks like. So you can gain more information about resource data management. You don't have to confine yourself to actually just rewatching the training sessions, etc. But there are things that I'll be covering, obviously, that you won't find on the library guide. And then finally, we have the various services that we provide. So we have support services divided into two categories. That is the data stewardship services category, as well as the user support services. So we can review data management plans. We support people in terms of data management, as well as the data curation. That is when the data are uploaded into the resource data repository. And we obviously can have consultations, as well as related training sessions. And you're actually attending one of those training sessions. So that is basically what's on offer from a support perspective. And if you want to contact us for further information, you can contact myself, or you can contact my colleague, Tobiden Tetra. That brings me to the end, but so basically we went through what resource data are, what resource data management is, we didn't cover a brief history of resource data management. We actually went through the fundamental aspects of resource data management. And then we went through the life cycle, RDM life cycle, as well as the various support structures in place at the university. That brings me to the end, but before I end off, I do want to indicate, if you haven't seen the address already, we will be going into more detail into data management planning this week, and then next week, a deeper dive into the management of sensitive resource data, and then 2 weeks after that, we'll go into data publication, as well as how to work with the research data repository itself. Tomorrow's one should be quite interesting because it's a gamification experience of working with research data and not just a lecture as such. So it will be based on a game known as the RDM adventure game. So you can actually get to play that game and get to learn about research data management. I think there is now room for questions before we go into possibly completing that assessment. See what you actually gained from this session. Are there any questions that we have online or here within the physical venue? Or comments, concerns? Yes, sir.
Actually, it's not a question. Data management, storage, and usage. The ethics community put a critical eye on that. I know from my experience. Move forward, move back, I'm sure this workshop supposedly to be introduced to people before they attend to that ethics application. But I'm sure it's a university. Maybe to get in the deep sea.
So I ideally you probably want to know something beforehand, but the ethics office actually has its own training sessions as well on research ethics that is conducted by the office. Dr. Janet Hayward is the chair of the university's HREC, and she basically has oversight of that. Yeah. Question. Oh, so it's basically just a comment in this case about it's a comment that what we learned today about mentioned data storage and research ethics, that these are things that actually what was mentioned today is something that would feed into the ethics application process, and that the assumption is that you should at least know these things before you actually apply for ethical clearance. That perhaps the university is already aware of this. So what I was stating is that there is training that is offered by the ethics office. Incidentally, I'm actually on the ethics committee. I'm actually the deputy chair of the institutional HREC, that is the Human Research Ethics Committee. And we, on the committee, I didn't show this here, but there is a SOP that was developed for the sensitive management of research data, or at least for data storage. But there is training that takes place, standard training for ethics purposes, and it does cover things such as the anonymization of data, the identification of data, as well as other things beyond research data. The protocol or form that people need to complete when they apply for ethics clearance does also include a module or a section on how the research data will be managed, whether the data will actually be published, how they'll be published. There's a privacy section there, how the data will be stored. And I've made recommendations about how you'd want to incorporate the questions that you look at when you look at the security plan. Ultimately, if you have a data management plan, it should gel with those kinds of questions. You should be able to take the data management plan and attach it as an appendix, so to speak, to your ethics application. So it's definitely true that people should ideally know these kind of things before, rather than after applying for it, because you might get rejected because you didn't have these things in order, whereas you will benefit by knowing these things, and you would at least clear that part. But perhaps more important for research is that some funders actually require data management plans as part of the application process. It might weigh maybe 10, even 15% of the total mark when you look at the scale that the funders would actually be looking at. But from a postgraduate perspective, it would really be the important lies with the ethics application in that case. Are there any other comments or there's a question here? Yes.
So when you were referring to standardized schemas, and in my imagination, I thought of things such as SPSS, Jambovi, to say that we are trying to exchange data within systems, right? And then you mentioned now later on the legal considerations that we have, such as de-identification of the data. Now, as you speak of de-identification of the data, working from a humanities perspective, at some point when you de-identify your data, it loses its essence. But now in systems conversation, it has to be de-identified to protect ethically. But now when you move around to interpretation of that data, there's that. No, yeah. So I think that's where I am stuck. And perhaps this is also a plea of helping me understand the two systems, because I am going to use an online repository as well as the human aspect, where you have questionnaires and you have your data interpreted. Then it's from the questionnaire, you de-identify it, but you also don't want it to lose its essence. So, yeah.
How should you navigate that?
Yeah.
All right, so I'll just succinctly summarize the question. It's really, but if you're in fields like the humanities, the de-identification of the data also important, might actually reduce the what do you call it, the not the nature of the data, but it sort of like dilutes the core essence of the research data, so to speak. So how comprehensible are the data if you actually get rid of all the personally identifiable information? Now, these are things that I do plan on covering in more detail next week, because it also depends on the data that you actually collect, the kind of software, as you pointed out, because there are different types of de-identification techniques. Are you going to use masking? Are you going to use aggregation? There are like several that I'll actually showcase. And some of them will actually eliminate more data than others. And you want to strike that kind of balance. As you yourself actually analyze the data, you don't necessarily need to actually have the data de-identified so that you can actually understand the data. It's really for the purposes of sharing the data publicly. So when the data move from systems, from SPSS to something else, for instance, it's perfectly fine. What the proprietor states is that the sensitive data should not be published, not that you shouldn't share it between systems as you actually analyze the data. That is perfectly fine. The question is not, now that you've actually understood the data, the question, must you know someone's name or surname? Must you know their specific date of birth? Because you can actually use ranges. For instance, if you have someone who was born on the 1st of January 2000, you can have that as a date range, ranging from the year 2000 to 2010, and they'll be captured, or 2000 to 2005. You can have an age range, say someone is either between the ages of 10 and 15. So you can aggregate the data so that statistically it is still significant, but it does not disclose too much. That's how you actually navigate that. But remember, you can move the data between systems, but the publication part is really where you actually start looking at whether the data need to be de-identified. But I will canvas that in more detail next week. There are literally 2 sessions just to go into unpacking that. But we'll go through the different techniques that are actually used to de-identify data. There'll be about 5 or 6 that I'll actually go through, and then you can see which one is more appropriate for the purposes of what you're doing. But for the most part, what you're doing is a bit of statistical disclosure. And for even more insight, one might want to approach the statistics department in terms of actually proceeding to implement that de-identification. What I'll give you is a bit more of a theoretical aspect of that. I'm not going to sit there and I will introduce you to certain software that you can actually use, by the way. But one can also approach the stats department. But there's software that exists that allows you to actually de-identify the data using things such as k-anonymity and making sure that the data are still statistically relevant. We'll definitely go into that. But not a deep dive of the software as such, but this data that you can, the software that you can use, that you will be introduced, at least 2 different types of software that I'll introduce. Or is there any other questions? Any? Oh, yes,
Sorry,
please.
if you are not joining the session, you have to register.
Yes, you'd have to register because we take the stats individually for each and every single session. It'll be the same time, and I think tomorrow's one is set for, it's a 1.5 hour session, right? Or is it 1 hour?
Yes.
Probably 1 hour. Yes, but that one is it's a short presentation. Then we'll play a game. Then the short presentation. Then you play the game again. So it's a blended session. I hope you've had a chance to fill in the survey so that we can actually see whether what you learned was beneficial. But I thank you so much for attending physically as well as the virtual attendees. So if there are no questions virtually, then we'll bring this to an end. Thank you very much.